Are you using data to give you informed decisions for your business? Are you tracking your sales conversations? Are you looking at customer retention? There's all sorts of metrics and all sorts of info you can use to make good decisions in your business, yet so many business owners aren't using those kinds of things. We're going to dive into exactly why that is and what you can be doing even on the simplest form to make better decisions in your business. Hey, I'm your host, Blake Benz. I'm the host of the Good Advice Podcast, and you've come to the place to learn how to do business better. There's no fluff on this podcast. We're not going to talk about theory or academics around business. It's just good advice, the stuff that actually works in practice. Before we jump into today's episode, we have a word from one of the incredible businesses that sponsors the podcast. Check out this quick ad, and we'll be right back soon. Do you ever feel like your payment processor is robbing you blind? For some of us, it's not blind. We look at the amount of money that's going to our payment processor month after month, and a lot of times we ask ourselves, is there a better way? I'm making good money, yet so much of it isn't actually ending up in my pocket. In the world of payment processing, in many cases, it's a cashless world, so you have to have a payment processor you can really trust. I personally am a big fan of Brad Norwood, who's the owner of PrimePaymentsUSA.com. Brad's a business owner himself. He knows all the challenges that come with running a business. More importantly, he knows the value of an individual customer. See, some of these bigger businesses, they're all about scale. They're all about bringing in as many customers as possible. But do they know your name? Do they know your business? Do they know what's important to you? In many cases, the answer is no. And in worst cases, they're just looking to get as much money from every transaction that you work hard for, which really doesn't feel too good. So you got to reach out to Brad Norwood today and understand how he's doing business and why it can save you money month after month. More importantly, you might even ask him about his zero-fee payment processing that he's offering to a select few of people. Go to PrimePaymentsUSA.com and start putting the money that you worked hard for back into your pocket. So I want to tell you a story about a business that I spoke to probably in year one, maybe year two of Good Advice. This was years ago. It was probably, I guess it was around 2018, maybe 2019. Simpler times, right? Simpler times. It was a very different world, a pre-COVID world. And there was a print shop owner that I was speaking to who he had somehow, some way struck gold with his business. He was a print shop where it wasn't like apparel and he wasn't like putting things on. It wasn't like for uniforms or anything like that or swag or what have you. It was a literal copy and print shop, which almost in hindsight, I'm a bit shocked as to how well this guy was doing, because nowadays I feel like FedEx or what are the options actually out there for someone to go get something printed? I know personally I'll use the local library sometimes because it's just incredibly cheap and easy to use, but that's not always an option for people. Well, for whatever the reason, this guy, he ran a print shop and it was $1 million business. He had just recently broken $1 million in revenue and he was shocked. Now, he wasn't just shocked because of how well the business was doing. He was shocked because of how little he knew about his business. Now, listen to this for a second. I was asking this guy about the product he sold, the different kinds of ways he makes money in his business. Is it like add-ons? Is it like a certain type of service that he sells? And beyond just the most basic bits of information, he could not tell me. He didn't know anything beyond basic numbers for his business. And when it came to supplying his business, the most work he really did was essentially making sure there was enough paper, ink, and any other supplies that he would need for people to come in and pay for whatever service that they were trying to get from him in his store. But no data, no insights, nothing about how the business had grown, like I said, what services were doing well, and maybe even what services were a waste of time for him. I share that story because many of us think we're going to have a very similar experience with our business. Many of us think that, oh, that's going to be me. And we are in for a rude awakening when we take one example, one story, and we assume that this is the norm. I see this all the time, by the way, where someone will share a story about someone they know who quit their job, they burned the ships, they went all in on their business, and they became a millionaire in 6 weeks. And these are like story points that we often point to as, oh, it can happen, it can work, it's going to happen to me. Now, granted, many people aren't telling the stories about how their business crashed and burned because it's embarrassing, it's painful. We spend a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in our business. So to talk about these things as the failures that they can be, it's not something that we're necessarily running to social media to tell those stories. Often what gets told is, the story of the fisherman who went fishing and caught, and honestly, how it really is, it's not just, hey, I caught a fish, but it's, here's this fish I caught that was 10 times bigger than it actually was. It was a 20-pound grouper or what have you. I don't know anything about fish. I'm giving it in classic form. I'm giving an example of something that I know nothing about. But they say they caught a 20-pound fish and it wasn't 20 pounds. It was 4 pounds. But for the sake of the story, it, was compelling to tell the story around catching the 20-pound fish. So often what happens is we cling to these stories and we assume that this is reality for most of us. Airbnb is a great example of this. Airbnb and Uber specifically, Uber gets mentioned over and over and over again in terms of the example of a scrappy small business that was able to become a massive major brand, that was able to disrupt an entire industry. Netflix gets mentioned a lot with Blockbuster. If you don't know much about the startup world, these businesses are called unicorns. And if you know anything else about the startup world, you would know that many startups are chasing I don't want to say necessarily chasing the investor community, but they are ultimately, most of them are. But really, they're chasing to be the next unicorn. Now, what's funny about this is what is true about a unicorn? They're mythical. They don't exist. They're fantasy. Yet we take this example of Uber, and I can't tell you the number of times that I've heard business owners, it's so much that it's actually a bit of a stereotype or a meme on the internet, but the number of business owners who have said things like, it's like Uber, but better. Or one example I got, someone was building a social media platform and we were making small talk over it. And I said, okay, well, tell me about the social media platform. And he goes, it's Facebook, but better. And I thought, okay, so it's better than this was early in my business. So I guess I don't know what revenue number they were like, but ultimately you're better than, I guess they're $1 trillion, something like that. I was like, so you're telling me you're building something better than that? Which, don't get me wrong, innovation happens constantly, but we take an example of one business that made it or disrupted or innovated, and it's easy for us to think that that will be my story. So today's podcast isn't really about, hey, if you have hopes for your business, get real. It's not going to happen. It's not that. It's not to say that you won't make it happen. Now, it is to say that the journey to success is incredibly longer and probably more painful and something that will require more patience from you than anything you've done previously. But the point of today's podcast episode is to run a successful business, you are going to have to get serious about the structure and organization of your business. We read stories about this print shop. We see stories. I even just see it on Shark Tank. Someone shows up, t-shirt, jeans, flip-flops. This is a very startup-esque stereotype, by the way. But, showing up in just, the clothes you slept in and having this genius idea, you can just know that probably will not be you. And when I say probably, I'd say statistically, not just unlikely, but keep dreaming because it probably won't get anywhere near you when it comes to that kind of striking luck and timing and fortune. Um, I've just, and maybe I'm speaking out of someone who's never been, struck gold with luck, but that I've had to create all of my opportunities for myself. I'm talking about this because often what I see in businesses are business owners who they are riding the high of a story of someone who was deeply successful, and they're not willing to put in the work developing the habits they need to actually be successful. They hear the story about the person who woke up whenever they wanted, stayed up as late as they want. They're an entrepreneur, quote, and made it big, and they think that's their next big ambition. More importantly, a lot of us left a corporate job or left the corporate world to trailblaze or create or do something different. And I don't know if this is necessarily tied to age or what we see in younger people, but I have noticed that many entrepreneurs, when they start a business, they are energized around this idea of finally being free from their boss or their manager or the corporate lifestyle. They're free to create. They're free to design things as they want. They're free to try things without someone being over their shoulder or to create their own schedule or what have you. So when we think about the stereotypical spirit robbing corporate culture that is, time clocked down to the minute, where if you're a minute late, you're docked time. It's so highly structured and organized that you feel like you can't breathe. What I have found is that many business owners go from ditch to ditch, where when you start to talk about revenue or closing percents or the number of, what your pipeline looks like, the number of people that you're reaching out to and what your sales initiatives look like and what your margins are. And I mean, there's all sorts of business terms you can throw out there. What I found is that many business owners get extremely averse to that kind of conversation because they associate it with the world that they left. They associate it with that was a world that lacked creativity, it lacked inspiration, it was hard to work there, and I'm creating my own path now. So understand for a second that the reason why corporations and big businesses use these kinds of systems is because at scale, at least, they work. In some ways, they work. They allow a level of accountability, for better or worse, that then allows the leaders of those organizations to make as objective decisions as possible. I don't know if you guys remember, did you guys ever do that? Oh man, what was it called? This was a thing. I don't think this is a thing anymore because I haven't heard about it in years. But when I was in college, there was a workout program that was on a DVD, P90X. You guys remember this? P90X. And then there was another one called Insanity. I think I did that. If you know me personally, you know I just hate exercise. So unfortunately, if you're listening to this podcast and you've listened to other podcasts where the person talks about getting up at 4 a.m. and going to the gym and, being incredibly precise on the things that they eat. And yeah, I'm sorry. That's just not me. I'm up at 4 a.m. only because my kid wakes me up. I got two young kids that'll wake me up. So anyway, I remember doing this P90X and what was the guy's name? I remember, if you guys ever saw Heavyweights, Ben Stiller reminded me of this guy in a less murderous way, obviously, but great movie, by the way. You should check it out. Anyway, So this guy, he had a comment in his exercise routine, and it was almost always whenever he was wrapping up an episode, but he would say, "Hey, write down the weights that you're clocking in at. Write down how much weight you're lifting." And then he would say, "Because if you don't know where you are today, you don't know where you're going, you don't know where you've been, you got no idea." And he'd say it much, wittier than that, I guess. The same thing's true about businesses is if you're going to make good decisions about your business, you have to be willing to be objective about your business. You have to be willing to look at the data and see what's actually working rather than having your head in the clouds and being in love with a certain idea or being committed to a certain idea. This isn't just things that are working well for you. I think sometimes we have someone we love or someone who cares about us or someone close to us who says, "Hey, Blake, you should really do this." And because we value that person's perspective, we go all in on it, even though it's maybe not a good idea for the business. So when you think about making good decisions for your business, I want to encourage you, you have to embrace systems in some way. You have to embrace data in some way. Now, if you're longer in the tooth when it comes to running a business, you probably already use something like this extensively. You probably use a CRM tool. You have probably some kind of task management software. You probably use something that helps you keep track of your deliverables with your customer. And if you've been in business and you're doing business at any kind of scale that I would say is over 100K, and you haven't started doing something like that, unless you are in an incredibly niched business where you are running that unicorn brand, where you've struck gold in some way, you're probably leaving money on the table. I think about that print shop. That was $1 million print shop. The story's incredible. He struck gold. But I can't help but think about the amount of money he was leaving on the table by not knowing what were the most valuable parts of his business. As business owners, regardless of how smart you are, or how clever you are, or how driven you are, or how intentional you are ultimately biased. And not even necessarily biased in a bad way. It's just that of all the data, and data is the wrong word, of all the stimuli that that shows up before you, only certain ones are going to jump out at you based on your experiences. It's like someone who had a horrific boss. When they think about a business, they're probably first thinking about leadership because they know the pain of having a bad boss. Whereas someone who's never had a bad boss, which, by the way, if you've never had a bad boss, you might have been that boss. But the person who's ever had a truly bad boss, that's not going to be a priority for them. I mean, I don't want to say it's not going to be a priority. It's not going to be the first priority for them. Our experiences drive what rises to the top for us when we make decisions. It just simply is what it is. It's how we operate as people because our brains, being the massive computers that they are still limited and they're not able to endlessly process every single detail in front of you. That should worry you because it should tell you or give you an insight as to how subjective we are when we make decisions in business. So why aren't we more data-driven? Why aren't we more structured? I think in some ways it is, there's a nervousness there. I think about getting into something, having to learn or teach something like a CRM tool can be very overwhelming and intimidating. There's not necessarily a user's manual for this kind of stuff. I shouldn't say that. There's endless YouTube guides on almost literally anything you can think about. But when you sign up for these programs, it's designed for business owners who look for this kind of stuff. So it's not necessarily something to, bring someone in who's green on the whole subject. Another reason, though, is because we are in trailblazing and creating our own path. We see some of these things as antithetical to how we want to do business. And I think this is a a bigger struggle for creatives, honestly. I don't really see this as much of a problem with people who are in service-based businesses, people actually offering a specific service that I think about plumbers, electricians, painters, cleaners. I mean, there's any number of service-based business that have been any of those, but a lot of these businesses I found over the years are much quicker to jump into these kinds of softwares. And honestly, a lot of these specific industries, they have their own CRM tool specifically for that industry. But it's often creatives who really struggle with this because they love the idea of being a free spirit and doing things as they want to do it and letting their inspiration drive them. That often when it comes down to getting on a software platform and writing down, filling out customer information and maybe where someone is in the pipeline and what the data around all those interactions looks like, a lot of people, I mean, they would rather smother themselves than have to go through things like that. So I want to offer you, wherever you are in that, let's say if you're someone who you're already doing stuff like this, I'd say hats off to you. You've developed a habit that good business owners, it's a great, I'm trying to keep saying habit. It's just a great principle to drive your business with. We keep track of customer information, customer data. We make decisions around our customers, and we're letting the data that we're tabulating guide our strategic decisions. If you're already doing something like that, you've developed a great habit for your business. You really have. If you haven't done something like that, here's what I want to challenge you with today. Even if you're intimidated by something like one of these platforms, to do nothing at all is ultimately an excuse. And if you've been deeply struggling in your business, whether that's getting new customers, keeping your customers, or what have you, this is probably a big piece of it. The number of times I talk to people, I mean, it shocks me. Even larger brands, I say larger, they're still small, but even larger brands, $200,000, $300,000, we're asked questions like, what's your revenue like? What did you make this last month? What did you make last year? What was 2023's revenue? The number of times I get blank stares around, okay, give me a ballpark. Was it more than 100K? Was it more than 300K? Are you $1 million? Now, I wouldn't say are you $1 million, but every $1 million business, for the most part, they have things figured out and have developed some kind of system around their business. But the low six figures, the people under $500,000, you might be surprised how many people are like, I don't even know. They're like that print shop, but deeply less successful. They're like, I couldn't tell you. I don't know. When I say, where do most of your customers come from? I'm not even sure. Okay, let's talk about your most recent customer. Tell me about him. Yeah, we had this guy who, okay, yeah, well, how did they find you? Was it online? Was it through paid ads? Was it through social media? Was it a referral? I don't know. I never asked. So if you aren't being intentional about this stuff, you are like a paper boat. You know those movies or kids when they create like a little paper's not right because paper gets wet and sinks, but like the little small like craft ships. And I think of one of those small craft ships getting like placed in the middle of the ocean and then a storm comes. You're going to get tossed left and right all over the place. And if you felt that way about your business, this might be the reason why. It could be that you're not being intentional enough about creating guardrails and systems for your business. You don't need to have a system that is exhaustive and something that requires hours of input from you. But you do need something that you can use to be objective and get a sense of making good strategic decisions around. I would recommend Google Sheets of just starting with something. Like if you need just anything, start with Google Sheets. And the kinds of things that I would track, a handful of things. If you sell a product, what are you selling the most of? Or rather, just what are you selling of each one? Or if it's a service, I'd also ask yourself who your customers are. What do they typically buy from you? Why did they buy it? And at what price point did they buy it at? I would look at, if you're running a longer business, I would look at customer churn and customer retention. How long do customers typically stay with you? What does that typically look like? Now, for me, I've been in business for 6 years. I can answer many of these questions extremely quickly and extremely easily because I use data like this to make quick decisions and intentional, thoughtful decisions for my business. I know that typically when I do business from the consulting side of a customer, depending on how desperate they were when we began working together, depending on the quality of the customer, which I've done a lot better in the last few years of just really honing in on the right customers, the right quality customers. But when it's a right high quality customer, I know what that process looks like in terms of retention, rather than what a lot of people do, which is they made the sale and they move on to the next customer. And then they wonder 3 or 4 years later, why none of their customers at that present moment are the same customers they had 3 or 4 years previously. Why didn't I keep any of my customers? Now, I probably oversimplified this because I was like, oh, it's easy. Just start tracking these things. Then I named off like 15 different things. But it's different based on where you are in your business's life cycle. So I'll just focus in on one specific group of people. Let's say you're listening and you are a very small business owner. You're under 100K. You're struggling to make ends meet. You're struggling to make sales. Here are the data points that I would track. I would open up a Google spreadsheet right now, and I'd have a handful of columns. The first column would be your prospects or your business names. The second column would be their contact, whether that's phone, email, what have you. There's a lot to be said about that, by the way. If you're mass emailing people, you can know it's not going to work as well as the many other creative ways you can stand out in a prospect's mind. But contact method, so name, contact method, how many touch points you guys have had. And I'd probably put a parameter around that of like how many touch points in the last year that you've had. Then I would put how likely they are to become a customer, how warm they are, and lastly, the last time you reached out to them. Those 5 things. Name, how to reach them. Now I've already forgotten what they were. Name, how to reach them, the number of times you've reached out to them in the last year, how likely they are to close with you, and the most recent time you talked to them. Then it's just a matter of being creative. If I have someone on there who I see that, okay, we've had 4 conversations this last year. I've probably color coded it to show that, these are, now this is, I'm making this now more expansive than I originally was intending to. But point being, you can look at that sheet and you can know who are the low-hanging fruit for my business. Or maybe who was someone who was kind of close to closing. They loved what you're doing. They said they were interesting. They just never signed the contract. But the last time you talked to them was 3 months ago. That's a great time to pick up the phone and say, hey, we kind of got away from each other. Hey, I'm sorry about that. I want to reach back out to you. Let's see, did you ever get this figured out? Did you ever get this solved? Let's have a conversation about it. And then if you look at someone on there and you've had, 12 conversations with someone over the previous year, and they are as cold as can be, there is 0 interest in your service. The last time you talked to them was 2 days ago, and they said, Blake, I'm not interested. I'm never buying from you. This is someone you can Mark off the list. This isn't someone that's worth spending my time on. Now, the reason this is valuable is because it's rarely that clear to us. Normally, we look at a sheet like this, and beyond the sheet or whatever service, whether it's a CRM or what have you, in our mind, we have people that we're anecdotally connecting with, eventually selling to, what have you. But when we have the objective data, we realize, oh, actually, that person was never going to buy from me. And I am spending an enormous amount of time and energy on this person for us to go in circles. Now, you're not going to put every person you've ever met on this sheet. You're only putting prospects, people that would potentially be a customer of yours. So like that coffee one-to-one you got with someone, you're not putting them on the list if they're not a potential customer. I mean, if they would never be interested in buying from you, you're not putting them on there. This isn't like a diary of every person you've ever met. It's not a friendship journal. You're not keeping track of relationships. You're being intentional about the people you're meeting and the events you're going to so that you can know what's actually working for your business. And if you fill out this spreadsheet and you take a look at it, you step back and you take a look at it, and you only have, you're struggling in your business and you only have like 5 people on this list. Well, what's my next move? It's to get out there and meet more prospects, to have more conversations, to talk to more people. I need to fill up this list. I need to fill up my pipeline. Now, that's one example. You don't have to do something like that. But at our Tuesday growth group meetup, I was asking a friend of mine about what he uses. And he's like, yeah, I don't use anything. And someone else was like, yeah, well, use a CRM. It's all great advice. But I wasn't sure if he was actually going to go do that. And in fact, sometimes with even my customers, when I'm saying, hey, this is really what you should do, I even had a customer last year where we were talking about something for his business. And as I wrapped up, I was looking at his face and I go, you're not going to do any of that, are you? And he goes, no, I'm probably not. He's like, I just know myself. I just know I'm probably not going to do. He said, it's a great idea. I know it works, but I just know myself and I know I'm probably not going to do it. So it wasn't that I didn't think this guy next to me wasn't going to do it, but I just thought, you know what? You got to do something though. Do something. Even if it's a Google sheet, do something as opposed to doing nothing. Like that's what you have to think about. But again, the whole purpose is to make objective decisions, good decisions for your business where the data drives your decisions rather than shiny objects, anecdotes. You had some freak deal where let's say you were an electrician and you were working on a house and you only do residential, and some dude sees your truck in the driveway and walks up and says, hey, I own a car wash. I need a light fixture fixed. Can you drive over here real quick and fix that? Yeah, I will. And then you've never done any commercial business in your life, but you're like, okay, yeah, I'm going to go explicitly for car washes, which actually probably wouldn't be a bad business since there's like 50,000 car washes on every street block, right? But understand, when you use data like this, it prevents you from going down a rabbit trail of something that would not have been good for your business, but it in the moment, it felt right. It felt good. And honestly, even going back to the car wash example, it's not that the data would show you shouldn't do car washes. What the data would show you would be, going back to that CRM or Google Sheet or what have you, is you would populate that with car dealerships with car washes. And then you would look to see what % of them actually closed, who ended up doing business with me, how many touch points did it take, like how much time did it take to actually close them, and what was my return on investment? What was my revenue from these businesses? So what you'd actually do is you would take this one insight on, hey, this car wash needed my help. Is that because there's an unfound niche there? And then 6 months to a year later, you can say, hey, actually, yes, I am the electrician for car washes. This thing worked out really well because I made an intentional decision. Or you can say, you know what, that was a one-time freak deal and I'm not going to deal with that anymore. The point is, you're not letting the storm drive your ship. You're driving the ship. You're making the informed decisions. You're not letting the elements around you dictate where your business goes next. So to wrap up today, you got to do something. You got to try something, do something that works for you, It doesn't have to be the same thing that everyone's doing, but you got to do something. Hey, I appreciate you listening to today's episode. That's all we got. I hope you go out and make a lot of money and hopefully track some good data with your business. Remember, this stuff works. It works. Just find the ways that it works for your business and the specific apps or softwares or programs or what have you that gel well with how you're doing business today. All that to say, I appreciate you listening to the podcast today. Thanks to our sponsors, our Patreon subscribers at patreon.com/goodadvice. We'll be back later this week with another episode of the podcast. That's today's good advice. We'll see you later. Thanks.